Look, over the next hour or so, I'm going to give you a presentation really about the high-level findings from the State of Service report and our most recent employee census. I'll talk briefly about some of the priorities that the Commission is focusing on, and then I'll pass over to Helen to talk about some of the census results in more detail. The State of the Service report comes from the employee census, and thank you for many of you who contribute to it. We had almost 100,000 people respond, and it's one of the biggest employment surveys done anywhere. As Rosemary's mentioned, the majority of APS staff, that's 62%, work outside Canberra. Of those 62%, however, only 14% work outside a capital city. But this is increasing from 12% 5 years ago. There are distinct differences, as you would appreciate, between Canberra and the regions in the type of work performed and the workforce itself. Effort in the regions is squarely focused on service delivery. 43% of staff indicated they worked in service delivery in the regions, while only 3% of staff in Canberra nominated service delivery. The most common job family of employees in Canberra is strategic policy, with 15% of employees saying that, closely followed by 14% who nominated ICT. By comparison, in the regions, 2% of staff work in strategic policy and less than 9% nominated ICT. Staff employed in the ACT tend to have more senior roles, which again is unexpected. Is to be expected, I should say. There are much higher levels of EL staff in Canberra, 44%, where the regions only have between 14 and 22%, so more than double EL staff in Canberra. SES, 4% in Canberra. Victoria has the highest representation of 1.2%. But irrespective of levels, all employees are important. And particularly in the regions, of course, there's a great deal of contact directly with customers and clients of the public service. There's a high number of female employees in the regions. Canberra staff are 57% female. Some states are as high as 65% female. There's a tendency for executive and SES staff to have a higher proportion of male employees in Canberra. More employees outside Canberra are non-ongoing staff and more are casual. In Canberra, 4% of staff are non-ongoing and 2% casual. In the regions, the proportion of non-ongoing staff is up to 8.7% and casuals at 9.5%. Quite a distinct difference. So that's just touching on some of the high-level data. As I say, Helen Bull will go into some of that in more detail. I now just want to touch on 4 or 5 themes for the coming year. And the first is productivity. I'm sure many of you have heard the phrases effective and efficient, smaller and smarter. And many of you in the room are no doubt graduates of the lean training methodology. At the centre of all these concepts is productivity, more correctly, improving productivity. The Australian Public Service is a large workforce with significant responsibilities and funded from the public purse. It's therefore not surprising that as a service that we're asked to structure and operate in a way that can achieve the most appropriate and efficient outcomes for Australians. So we seek to modernise, adapt and innovate to enhance productivity of the APS and allow it to provide the highest quality support to the government. And it's no surprise, I think all dynamic organisations across the country would be attending to those issues. And in doing that, I think one of the important things also is to look at to do we need to do everything that we're charged with doing? Are there things we can stop doing? And sometimes that's hard, it's difficult to identify, and sometimes hard to implement. But I'm sure that there's things across the whole public service that we may not necessarily need to be doing or devoting so many resources to. In this area, the Secretary's Board has created an APS Reform Committee to provide a focus on APS-wide initiatives that will work to achieve the objective of creating a more efficient, effective, productive and modern public service. I now turn to the future of work. The future of work. Look, it's important, I think, on this future of work issue. There's been a lot written about it lately, if you're interested in this area. But it's important to acknowledge that the nature of work and the way it's undertaken is dynamic, and both change regularly. But there's a lot of attention, as I say, given to things currently underway. Some of the changes happening now are evolutionary and essentially add to momentum for changes already occurring. Flexible models of work, such as teleworking, job sharing and labour hire, are examples. Other changes, however, are unprecedented, and much of this relates to digital and other technological innovation. The challenge for the government and the APS is to adapt to this change, including facilitating the engagement of contingent workers to deliver specific and specialist programs of work. Contingent workers are a long-established facet of Australian employment. Industries such as construction and IT have used them for decades. And often in the debate about this, a basic misconception is the attitude that contingent work is neither desired nor beneficial. Many people in Australia prefer to work in this manner. They embrace the independence, choice, flexibility and rewards that it offers. The contingent workforce has traditionally been understood to be essentially comprised of independent contractors and labour hire employees. Some would include non-ongoing and casual employees. However, it's now been transformed with the digital economy and modern business practices. The contingent workforce now includes gig and peer-to-peer workers and job marketplaces such as Airtasker, Uber, etc. So going forward, it's inevitable that some jobs will be replaced, others will be redesigned, and some with inherently human and decision-making roles will possibly continue with not a great deal of change. So it's going to be a challenge. We'll deal with it. I've noticed a couple of commentary items recently which I think state a very wise sort of observation that with this type of change in work, we tend to overestimate the short-term impact and underestimate the longer-term impact. So we're aware of that, and it's incumbent on us to adopt a sensible approach. It does offer, for me, I think, opportunities for the staff. The opportunities of better, more fulfilling and effective jobs. So I think going forward, the reforms will continue. Senior leadership, in my view, has to possess the capacity to see and then use the opportunities to work better. We will need to have clear communications to staff about the risks and the opportunities involved in the future of work. And we'll have to have systems to identify and learn new capabilities. They will be developed. I'll now turn to integrity. The integrity of APS employees is critical to the public services functions. I chair an integrity agencies group, which consists of agency heads involved in this area. We meet on a regular basis and we work to coordinate and promote and embed integrity in the Commonwealth public service. We will speak more about data about integrity later in the session, but I would think it's important to acknowledge that Code of Conduct investigations have dropped over the past 2 financial years, with investigations into behaviour of fewer than 0.3% of the total APS workforce conducted in 2016-17. And it's my view is that the public service operates most staff in a very ethical, conscientious manner. And I think in regard to that, leadership of ourselves and people in this room is a key. The setting of the tone and respect for integrity and proper conduct by the leaders is absolutely crucial, and we have to be very mindful of that. We have, I think, an excellent system in the public service. We have a code of conduct set out in the Act that's supported by APS values and APS employment principles, and they are really grounded in notions of decency, common sense, professionalism, and I think it's a system which by and large works effectively. 152,000 people, not everybody will make the right decisions and behave appropriately, but by and large we do operate in ethical and with integrity, and we have to be mindful of it, particularly us as leaders of the public service, and exhibit the proper values and behaviour. In regard to that, the results of the 2017 census show that respondents believe their colleagues, supervisors and senior leaders display APS values in their work. That, as I say, I think reinforces my view that there's a strong culture of ethical behaviour in the public service. We've seen a decline in the perceived experience of bullying or harassment. And agencies, of course, are introducing a variety of strategies to address unsavoury behaviours should they arise. And Helen will go into that in more detail in her presentation. And the last thing I want to touch on is bargaining, the workplace bargaining. A new policy, the workplace bargaining policy of 2018, has recently been released by the government. The last round of bargaining has now essentially been concluded. The new bargaining policy continues with essentially the principles of the last policy. APS enterprise agreements, of course, need to provide flexibility for agencies to adapt to the changing times. And workplace relations conducted effectively is not a once in a year, once in a 3-year activity. It's an ongoing two-way conversation and engagement between employers and unions. Agencies, we think, have identified gaps in workplace relations, and we're going to work with agencies to help them to build their capability to assist in conducting negotiations and bargaining, but also the continuous engagement with the employees on a better footing. But as I say, the essence of the policy is unchanged. The cap on wage movements is 2% on average a year. That's the maximum. Agreements are to be flexible. There's some GBEs are taken out of strict adherence to the policy, and there's some capacity to bargain and trade conditions of employment on a no increase in costs basis. But it is essentially they're continuing with what we had before in the bargaining space. So that's sort of the conclusion of my brief overview presentation. And now I call on Helen Bull. Helen is the Group Manager of the Workplace Information Group in the APSC, and is the Group Manager responsible for the census and the survey and the information that we gather. We have a very rich source of data about employment and employment aspects and attitudes in the public service, and Helen's role is to oversee and manage all of that. So I'll hand over to Helen.
Thank you, John. As John mentioned, I'm going to do a bit of a canter through the data and focus on a few key areas for the next 15 or 20 minutes before we open for questions. One of the things our data shows us is that we are a contemporary and professional public service. I know sometimes when we're sort of deep in the trenches and things are not going the way we'd like, we sometimes maybe query that. But certainly our data shows that we are focused on people, we do embrace diversity, we are exploring opportunities to improve a range of things related to our performance and our productivity, and we're always looking for ways of developing capability. We create inclusive environments at work. We address negative workplace behaviours such as bullying, harassment and discrimination. And when things don't go as planned, we have mechanisms in place to address that. Things like addressing corruption, misconduct and high rates of unscheduled absence. One of the other parts of my role is actually leading the Commission's international work. And I'm constantly struck by how many queries and requests to come and examine the system of public service we have in Australia, and the discussions we have with a whole range of countries across the world in both developing and developed economies is that our public service is seen as one of those best practice examples. So despite those times when we are a bit frustrated, I think we do have to reflect on that. So we're going to use some of the data that we collect. As John said, we have a very rich sources of data, and that's down to all of you. We have a rich longitudinal set of data in the APSC, in the APS employment database. We have demographic data on every public servant who's worked for the APS since 1966. It allows us to do a lot of trend analysis and see over time how we've changed in a lot of these areas. We also administer one of the largest employee surveys in the Southern Hemisphere through the APS employee census, and in the last few years we've continued to see the response rate to that survey continue to climb. Last year was 71%, so almost 100,000 employees, and some agencies, I think, were up about 95% of their workforce responding to that survey. So it's very reliable in terms of what it tells us about the APS. The workplace data that we collect helps us in the Commission sort of look at workplace strategies, workforce strategies, policies, and to evaluate how they're working across the whole of the sector. But we also provide a lot of our data to agencies to help them work with other data they collect to also do similar roles within agencies. And today, as I said, I'm going to use some of that data to underpin some of our messages. But first, I just want to share some information about Canberra, a bit more detailed information. And firstly, I'm going to talk about the typical public servant in Canberra, and you're going to help me with this. So I want everybody to raise their hand, please. Okay, now can you please keep your hand up if you're female? Sorry. Keep your hand up if you have a bachelor degree. Keep your hand up if you're in your early 40s. Okay, we are down to... Okay, last one. Keep your hand up if you've been continually working in the APS for about 10 years. Wow, not as many as I thought might be still left up, but congratulations to you. You're actually the typical public servant in Canberra, so we didn't have too many of those here today, so thank you. Okay, so the high-level snapshot for Canberra looks like this. There are some 57,500 APS staff working in Canberra. I think the public service, despite views of the media, makes up in total with the ACT government about a third of the workforce in the ACT. There aren't as many people here identifying as Indigenous or with a disability or from a non-English speaking background when compared to the entire APS workforce. However, in regards to those staff who identify as LGBTI+, you're on a par with the APS as a whole. The largest agency in Canberra is Defence, and it's not surprising that nearly half the APS staff in Canberra work in strategic policy, ICT, or in projects and programs. So as John mentioned in his speech, quite different to what we see of the 62% of staff located outside of Canberra. So one of the themes I wanted to talk about today was mobility. You might be aware that we've been running a program internally in the Commission, Operation Free Range, and looking at what the barriers are to mobility. So why do we do this? It is one of the areas that we're looking at in terms of how we sort of might look at our sort of productivity and what we might need to do to improve that. So the APS does face discrete skill shortages. We have an ageing population and a fiercely competitive labour market, all of which are situated in a tight fiscal environment that continues to demand seamless service delivery. And we need to have strategies to attract and retain the best people. And we also need to keep people engaged by making it easier for them to move to new challenges and opportunities. Some skills mixes are also changing as we experience things like technological expansion. This means we need a better way of getting the best from our workforce. Increased mobility is a smart strategy and an investment in the future capability of the APS. We know mobility is good for business and good for our people, but from the data we know that each year only around 2% of the APS moves to a different agency. The annual rate has not changed much in the last 15 years. Also noteworthy is that the majority of promotions are internal. 92% of promotions in 16-17 were awarded to staff already working in the particular agency in which they were promoted. Mobility rates are substantially lower for employees outside the ACT, so you might be sitting there thinking, oh, I didn't think it was that bad. But it is significantly different, and 62% of our workforce work out in our regional areas. So the difficulty in mobility is also reflected in the large number of employees who've only worked in their entire career in one agency. We've received feedback through our census from employees and from agencies when we do our annual agency survey that identify that there are fewer mobility opportunities outside of Canberra, especially in the regional areas. Often in these areas, the agency, the Commonwealth Agency, is the only employer or the main employer in the area, and there is limited opportunity to move unless the employee is willing to relocate to another capital city or to Canberra. And this becomes difficult for shorter term placements, and there can be significant costs of relocation or travel costs for any placements outside those areas. Feedback suggests that wording in a job ad seems biased to those already working in an area, and managers are sometimes reluctant to release employees due to difficulties in backfilling or talent hoarding. We know though that informal tap on the shoulder mobility works very well and is used frequently. Mobility also tends to be more effective when it's managed centrally and brokered, and we know that there are a number of agencies across the service who also have their own internal programs, and this is an Operation Free Range was looking at using these sorts of centralised arrangements to try and assist mobility. And it's particularly successful, the data shows that mobility is particularly successful where it's seen as part of professional development and it's linked to performance agreements. We acknowledge that mobility is difficult, and for some places, promotions may also be hard to come by. Therefore, development is increasingly important. And capability development is one of the key areas that the Commission is responsible for in terms of our broader cross-sector role. The good news is that most of you are aware of the areas that you need to develop, and we got that through your views on learning and development through the census. You take responsibility for your own learning, and when you do participate in learning and development, nearly 3/4 of you believe that it is effective in improving your work performance. A cornerstone of the APSC is building a strong and contemporary workforce to meet the challenges of today and the future. We invest significantly in people development, and so do you, because a lot of our development work has been funded through MOUs with agencies. And we also, in addition to that, offer a variety of learning and development opportunities. At the APSC, however, we've noticed that the uptake rate of learning and development opportunities that we facilitate based on request is very low in the regions, and we often have to cancel these courses. We are keen to know why this is and how we can improve in terms of the offerings that we have in this regard. We know that agencies are prioritising capability development, with almost all agencies looking to improve talent management capability, I think roughly over the next 3 years. Talent management helps agencies and the APS to develop a strong and diverse leadership pipeline. It's a forward-looking initiative that strengthens the quality of the APS leadership. And talent management approaches need to be supported and driven by senior managers in agencies. Results from the employee survey are encouraging, with 43% of employees agreeing that their SES manager takes time to identify and develop talented people, compared to 30% of employees in the previous survey, so we are seeing an increase in that area. Developing data capabilities has also been identified as one of the top 3 workforce priorities for agencies. And as part of that, the APSC has been engaged in some work with data deputy secretaries and data champions across the APS. So far, this partnership has resulted in the APS Data Skills and Capability Framework. And I know my colleagues in the Centre for Leadership and Learning are doing some more work on how we might be able to develop e-learning around data capability. Agencies rated their digital capability as having neither a high nor low level of maturity. And so most agencies on digital have seen themselves at a mid-level of maturity. Scope for improvement is likely with the continued prioritisation of digital transformation across the APS. In 2017, the APSC commenced a new policy proposal in collaboration with the Digital Transformation Agency to build digital capability across the APS. The work has a number of key delivery areas. Firstly, developing digital capability. Secondly, building digital leadership capability in order to promote digital transformation. And thirdly, identifying and attracting digital talent. I now want to move on to performance management, which is an area that we do ask a series of questions in the census, and it's quite crucial for us in terms of getting the best from our people. Partly that means for us being clear about expectations, setting goals, and talking about how the employee can continue to develop. Having regular discussions about performance, capability gaps, and skilling needs is something that the APSC encourages. The APSC supports an APS performance management community of practice, which provides guidance and shares good practice through regular forums and communications. If you consider yourself to be a performance management practitioner, we'd like to hear from you. So please let us know and see how you can become involved in this. APS agencies are taking steps to increase the effectiveness of their performance management strategies. 64% of agencies report having revised performance management policies in the previous 12 months, and 88% of agencies have planned to do so over the next year. Almost all APS agencies have strategies in place to support individual performance improvement, and effective management of underperformance is also fundamental to performance management. However, the data shows that 41% of respondents to the survey do not believe their agency deals with underperformance effectively. In some agencies, more than half held this view. In others, less than 5%. We'd like to know more about this, and we will certainly be exploring this issue through asking further questions in this year's census. All agencies report making newly engaged employees subject to probation, with only 80 people having their employment terminated during probation. On average, that's less than 1 employee per agency. Probation can deal with underperformance long before it becomes an entrenched problem, and the APSC is working on ways to encourage agencies to use probation as a time to seriously evaluate whether the person is the right fit for the job, the agency, and the APS. Effective performance management is clearly an ongoing challenge for the APS, and we must continue to focus on creating and maintaining a positive performance culture and remove preconceived ideas that performance management is simply a tick and flick process. Having regular discussions about performance and development is a good opportunity to address poor performance. It opens up the conversation about negative workplace behaviours such as absenteeism, bullying, and harassment. Alongside these are issues of misconduct, integrity, and corruption, and I'll now turn to some of those. So for some years, we have been tracking APS workforce information data, which shows that employee engagement is much higher. Where employee engagement is higher, employees take fewer days off work. We know that an engaged workforce is more productive and less likely to look for opportunities to leave the APS as soon as the opportunities arise. And the APSC is committed to addressing unscheduled absence across the workforce. We have seen a downward trend over the last couple of years in the rates of unscheduled absence since 2014-15. The decrease from 11.5 days per employee in 15-16 to 11.4 days per employee in 16-17 doesn't sound like much, but it actually equates to 45 minutes per employee in the APS. When you think about that as a whole, that is a reasonably increased level of productivity. We know from time to time that people will need to take leave, either due to illness or for carer responsibilities. But we've developed an online toolkit as part of an absence management campaign to give clear guidance on attendance management issues. Factors that have been found positively to impact unscheduled absence include that expectations on attendance are clearly communicated, managers are equipped to respond to unscheduled absence, that there is timely and simple unscheduled absence data available to employees and their managers. Managers act early to identify if there is a problem, and where there is a problem, managers and employees work together to develop a joint plan to address the issues. We also work in this space with agencies through a community of practice to share attendance good practice, and recently partnered with Comcare on developing and sharing further resources. The Commissioner spoke about integrity and the importance of that as a platform across the APS. The APS takes corruption very seriously. All APS employees are obliged to comply with the APS values and code of conduct, and senior leaders are required to promote the values and the employment principles outlined in the Public Service Act. The data indicates that the level of corruption in the Australian Public Service is low. 121, or less than 0.1% of employees were investigated for corrupt behaviour in 2016-17. The data also shows that there is a strong culture of ethical behaviour in the APS, with more than 80% of employees saying their colleagues and supervisors act in accordance with the APS values. The data also shows us that employees are confident that workplace colleagues would report corruption, confident that individual employees would know what to do if they identified workplace corruption. This data helps us to identify issues that may need further attention. For example, just over 1% of employees reported that they had witnessed green lighting, which is making official decisions that improperly favour a person or company or disadvantage another. This alerts us to an issue that may seem small in a numbers sense, but reflects more broadly on ethical decision making. Agencies have in place a number of strategies to detect misconduct. These include both active measures like monitoring use of IT and means to report issues of concerns. Misconduct in the APS is a concern, but it should be seen in a context. Code of conduct investigations involving 596 employees were finalised by the APS during 2016-17. As the Commissioner mentioned, this represents less than 0.3% of the total APS workforce. Where appropriate, sanctions are applied for breaches, the most common being reprimands, followed by reductions in salary. The majority of misconduct found was in the following areas: misuse of departmental or corporate credit cards, claiming leave with no entitlement, false claim regarding hours worked or recording attendance, fraudulent medical certificates, improper use of inside information to gain benefits, and conflicts of interest. The integrity of APS employees is critical to the public services function. The Australian community is entitled to expect APS employees will behave with the highest level of personal integrity. Results from the 2017 employee census show that respondents believe their colleagues, supervisors and senior leaders display the APS values in their work. This suggests there is a strong culture of ethical behaviour. The two aspects of the Code of Conduct that were most investigated in 16-17 were behave in a way that upholds the APS values and employment principles, and behave honestly and with integrity. All APS employees and agencies have a shared obligation to create respectful workplaces. and the APS does not tolerate workplace harassment and bullying. Workplace harassment and bullying, we have seen in the last couple of years a bit of a reduction, where the decline in people's experience or perceived experience of bullying and harassment has reduced from 17% to 15%, although 15% is still a reasonable proportion of the workforce. Results from the 2017 employee census showed that the most typical form of bullying and harassment was verbal abuse. Just over 1 in 3 respondents who perceived experiencing bullying and harassment identified a co-worker as the source of these behaviours. Agencies are tackling bullying and harassment through a number of different strategies. These include offering interpersonal skills training to staff, implementing harassment contact officers, and ensuring there are policies and procedures in place to address these behaviours should they arise. Now, diversity and inclusion. We recognise across the APS the benefits of nurturing a diverse and valued workforce. Fostering inclusive cultures in the workplace is a practice that is performing relatively well across all APS agencies, with an increased focus on representing the community which we serve. The current focus of most agencies in this area appears to be on expanding the range of employment opportunities for people with a disability and investing in developing the capabilities of employees with disability. These are action items from the APS Disability Employment Strategy. Indigenous representation in the Commonwealth continues to increase, currently sitting across the whole of the Commonwealth at 2.7%, slightly higher for the APS at 3.2%. Agencies are working well to improve awareness of Indigenous culture in the workplace and are focusing on expanding the range of Indigenous employment opportunities and increasing the representation of Indigenous employees in senior roles. The majority of agencies reported implementing actions relating to the gender equality strategy in the annual survey in 2017. We are seeing a shift in the culture as agencies progress towards embedding practices into everyday business. Women in leadership and flexible work arrangements continue to be areas of focus for the APS. The number of women in the SES roles is at its highest since 2000. As mentioned earlier, in 2017, for the first time, the APS employee census asked all respondents if they identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans or intersex. The experience of LGBTI+ staff is broadly positive. Work groups and supervisors are perceived to be accepting and understanding of diversity and inclusion more broadly. The census for 2018 is currently out for consultation with agencies, and it will be in this field starting the 8th of May for a month.